Chastity and the Practice of the World in Hume's Treatise by Catherine Villanueva Gardner. Abstract. Commentaries on the treatise have not always been clear as to why Hume includes a discussion of the virtue of female chastity among the apparently different artificial virtues of justice, promises, and allegiance. Placing Hume's discussion of chastity within its specific historical location can illuminate its presence and role in Book 3 of the treatise, and demonstrate how chastity is a virtue of social utility. An examination of the practice of the world can show how female chastity was a necessary virtue for the emerging middling classes of the 18th century in their pursuit of economic stability and social status. The location of Hume's discussion of female chastity as an artificial virtue at the end of Book 3, Part 2 of A, Treatise of Human Nature, can tempt us to seeing this discussion as an afterthought, or to treating chastity as the least important of the artificial virtues. Thanks in the most part to the work of Annette Bayer, this section has come to be seen as meriting discussion. However, commentaries on the treatise have not always been clear why exactly Hume includes a discussion of the virtue of chastity among the apparently different virtues of justice, promises, and allegiance. Despite Hume's claim that chastity is in the general social interest, chastity is, as Bayer claims, different from other artificial virtues. Among other things, chastity is a virtue which emphasizes consistency within an individual's life rather than consistency within a population. However, consistency within a population is a feature shared by the other artificial virtues. We should recognize that for Hume's contemporaries, the issues of chastity would have been an evident and important one. The sort of audience that Hume would have had in mind for the treatise would have already accepted female chastity as a socially imposed virtue, and, even if they would not have used those terms, recognized the artificiality or social utility of the virtue of female chastity. In other words, Hume's account would have been accepted with little comment. We need to understand what Hume calls the practice of the world, specifically the practice that he could have been observing during his time of writing the treatise. Placing Hume's discussion of female chastity within its specific historical location can illuminate its presence and role in Book 3 and demonstrate how chastity is a virtue of social utility. Moreover, placing the virtue of chastity in its socio-cultural context will allow us to see Hume's account of the passions and sympathy as connected in ways to women's chastity that would have reflected the concerns and attitudes and even the actual process of the development of the middling class of the 18th century. The discussion of chastity as an artificial virtue that follows is restricted to an examination of Hume's comments in the treatise. This is because the focus of this discussion is on examining why chastity is supposed to be an artificial virtue in the same way that justice is an artificial virtue. It would be a mistake, however, to think that Hume's comments in section 12 are his final or only comments on the virtue of chastity, marriage, or the family. In his comments in later works, specifically a dialogue, as well as some of his essays, Hume's views become more flexible, perhaps because he has observed more of the practices of the world as he grew older. Unfortunately, a thorough comparison of these works with the treatise is beyond the framework of this discussion, and it is only possible to note points of comparison or interest. Section 2 of Hume's Treatise. The main aim of Section 12 is to demonstrate how the moral obligations attached to the sexual behavior, like the other artificial virtues, are generated by the social utility of this behavior. Female chastity is in the general interests of society. But we should not ignore another element central to the argument of this section. Hume is drawing a parallel between his discussion of the obligations of princes or nations in the previous section and the obligations of women. In this previous section on the laws of nations, Hume claims that nations, in the same way as private individuals, have the same interests in creating and maintaining the laws of justice, and that these natural obligations of interest lead to the same moral obligations as for private individuals. Yet, as the interest of nations in justice is not as strong as that of private individuals, the moral obligation that comes from this interest of nations is correspondingly not as strong. We must necessarily give a greater indulgence to prince or minister who deceives another than to a private gentleman who breaks his word of honor. Hume's aim here is to show how his system can account for the accepted political realities. Furthermore, as in the case of chastity, he claims that an examination of the practice of the world can offer us a far better understanding of our moral duties than can be offered by abstract speculation. He says, however, in the introductory paragraphs of section 12, that he recognizes that some people may still not accept his claims about the laws of nations, specifically the claim that the moral blame or praise we assign to the behavior of princes is sufficiently explained from the general interests of society. He therefore states his intention to support these claims about the laws of nations by considering the duties of modesty and chastity. Hume's consideration of the virtues of modesty and chastity will lend support not only to his general principle that the artificial virtues are derived from social utility, but also to the variant of this claim in section 11, where he found that differences in the degree of moral obligation are relative to social interest. He intends to compare the force of the virtue of chastity relative to men and women with the differences in the virtues expected of princes and private individuals. Thus, we find in his concluding paragraph of section 12 that he says that the obligations of men to be chaste bear nearly the same proportion to the obligation of women as the obligations of the law of nations do to those of the law of nature. While men, like princes, cannot do anything they want, the social interest in their chastity is not as strong as for women, and thus the moral obligation to be chaste is not as strong. Thus, once we read sections 11 and 12 together, we can see that Hume uses the generally accepted sexual double standard to support the more controversial double standard for princes. To understand why Hume would have taken the sexual double standard as a given, we need to ask a more fundamental question of what exactly were the social interests that female chastity served. Most specifically, we must ask what social interests Hume would have observed being served during this period he was writing. Hume's account of chastity as an artificial virtue. In section 12, Hume begins by claiming that there is no foundation in nature for the behaviors of female chastity and modesty. Despite his initial reference to modesty, he focuses on the artificial virtue of chastity. This notion, he says, comes from education, from voluntary conventions of men, and from the interest of society. Men look after children, and such rearing is obviously necessary for humans, because they think these children are their own. Female chastity is necessary in order to ensure this security of paternity. As the social stigma attached to female infidelity may not be enough to guarantee that women will resist temptation, an insistence on modesty from an early age induces in young girls a repugnance to all expressions and postures and liberties that may lead to seduction. Hume claims, however, that it is not as yet clear how female chastity is to be produced and ensured. On the one hand, female adultery is to be set up as a heinous transgression. Yet on the other hand, the desire for sexual pleasure that leads to this transgression is a strong natural urge that is absolutely necessary for the continuation of human beings. While the speculative philosopher cannot offer theoretical reasonings to answer this question, Hume claims that the actual practice of the world has already shown us how the question can be answered. This practice shows that those who have a particular interest in the fidelity of women will naturally disapprove of their infidelity, while those who have no interest either way are carried along with the rest, the stream, and by a tendency to sympathy for the general interests of society. The first part of this claim is clear. Husbands will obviously have an interest in the fidelity of women. The second part, however, requires further explanation. Here I take Hume to be saying that female chastity is not to be understood just as being in the interests of one particular societal group, husbands, but it is justified, like the other artificial virtues, as being in the general interests of society. These general interests mean that women are educated towards chastity from childhood, and as this becomes a general rule, chastity extends to all women. Thus, even though the social usefulness of chastity is just for women of childbearing age, it extends in our minds to all women. Hume further adds that men's moral obligations with regard to chastity, according to the general notions of the world, are not so great as those of women, as the social interest in men's sexual behavior is weaker. But what then are these social interests? 18th century sexuality. Building a picture of what Hume calls the practice of the world requires a thorough examination of the issues of sexuality, property, and class. The first step is to ask what sector or sectors of society Hume was observing. Giving the significance of Hume's social context for the argument of this paper, a fairly lengthy examination of this context is required. While Hume was Scottish, we would be mistaken to believe that his observations were not more general. Given where Hume lived and worked and his social class and professional aspirations, we can safely assume that he was observing perhaps morals that were both Scottish and English. The political and cultural relationship of Scotland to England is a complex one even for today, but I would argue that it is unlikely that his explicit focus would have been Scotland per se. Those more distant geographical areas and social classes that were not closely identified, culturally and socially, with England. What attitudes towards marriage, adultery, and female sexuality might Hume then have observed in society during the period when he was writing? It would be a mistake to identify 18th century attitudes with the repressive ones that followed during the Victorian period. 18th century England, and not just among certain classes in London, permitted a high level of tolerance and visibility for sexuality. The omnipresence of prostitutes, body prints, and titillating novels all indicate that sexual indulgence and tolerance were not just confined to a tiny libertine, rakish fringe. Obviously, it was men, not women, who typically exercise these freedoms of behavior, but some of the freedoms of women may surprise us, although this is not to say that attitudes towards these freedoms were not often deeply ambiguous. Sex manuals and information were available to women, and newspapers carried advertisements for the services of gigolos. The masquerades of London were the fashionable place for young people of varying social ranks to go, yet these masquerades were notorious for sexual possibilities unleashed by costume design. Hume's contemporary Lady Mary Montagu exclaimed against the unpopularity of the married state, which is scorned by our young girls nowadays as once by the young men. Many feminine libertines may be found amongst young women of rank. No one is shocked to hear that Miss So-and-so, maid of honor, has got nicely over her confinement. How did the sexual tolerance play out in the freedoms, if any, allowed married women? Obviously, the double standard was prevalent, but we can see that attitudes, at least in the upper classes, toward female adultery were not as strict as one may imagine. Consider, for instance, the family life of the Duke and the Duchess of Devonshire, who had his mistress living with them. Not only did they bring up the Duke's children by his mistress, but also the Duchess's child by Lord Grey. Likewise, Lady Harley reputedly had children by so many lovers that her brood was known as the Harleian Miscellany. Given these relative freedoms, Hume's more rigid treatment of the need for female chastity may seem puzzling. It becomes clearer once we ask specific questions about the social interests that female chastity is supposed to serve, and when we recognize that there would have been class differences in the way the sexual double standard played out.